At the very center of our faith is not an idea or a philosophy or a theory. At the very center of our faith is a person who lived, a person who died a horrible death on a Roman cross, and a person who rose again from the dead. And so because Jesus is at the center, I believe any apologetic discussion has to eventually be brought back to Jesus. And more specifically, has to eventually talk about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that if the resurrection didn't happen, then our whole faith is futile. He says, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. There's simply no issue that's more important for us to discuss and to explore than the resurrection. If it happened, if the resurrection happened, then that confirms everything else. If the resurrection didn't happen, then nothing else really matters. And so the resurrection is a critical topic, a critical issue for us to discuss whenever we're talking about apologetics or giving the reasons for the hope that we have. Is belief in the resurrection, is it reasonable? Now, what I want to dedicate my time to in this session is giving an argument for the resurrection of Jesus using an approach that's called a minimal facts approach. Now, I didn't create this approach. This language has been used by several different authors, most notably a man named Gary Habermas, who wrote a really good book on the resurrection called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And what a minimal facts approach does is it tries to give just a number of different facts that all people can agree upon. Facts that a Christian and a non-Christian alike, a believer and an unbeliever, that these are all facts that are agreed upon by all people. And then it just asks the question, based on the facts that we know, what is the best explanation for these facts? What's the best explanation for these facts? And I have my own list of minimal facts that I'm going to give here in just a moment, but I've used this approach with skeptics, and I've asked them that exact question. What is the best explanation for these facts? And that opens the door to a wider conversation, a wider curiosity about why it is exactly that Christians believe in the resurrection and why belief in the resurrection actually might make sense. And so here's my list of minimal facts when I'm arguing for the reasonableness of the resurrection. And I'm going to confine my minimal facts to just single words, okay? So here's the first word. Testimony. Testimony. The testimony of the witnesses of the resurrection. The resurrection is testified by no less than 5 independent sources in the New Testament. Those sources are, and I want to give you several different things to keep in mind about this testimony. The first thing to keep in mind is that these sources are very, very early. The earliest testimony of the resurrection we actually have is in 1 Corinthians 15, which many scholars believe was written, the content of 1 Corinthians 15 anyway, was in circulation as early as 8 to 10 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Very, very early testimony. Here's what Paul says at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken a stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as first importance." Now, what Paul is acknowledging there is what he's about ready to say is something that he himself received. It's a teaching that he received, and now he's passing it along to the Corinthian believers. "What I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. This sounds like a very creedal type statement, that this is a belief statement that was already widely circulating among the churches at the time Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. He continues on to verse 6. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. So Paul is saying there are still witnesses out there that can testify to the truth of this statement. And so you can go and ask them for yourself. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. And so the testimony that we have in the New Testament is not only are there 5 different sources for this testimony, but this testimony is very early. Another thing to keep in mind about this testimony is that the testimony is uniform. It's uniform. Now, a lot of skeptics will bring up the point, well, the different gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection, they don't precisely agree with each other in every single detail. And indeed, that's true. But I would argue that the fact that they don't agree in every single detail actually lends credibility to the fact that these are different accounts from different perspectives where some of the details are indeed different. If they all were exactly and precisely the same, you could understand how a skeptic would say, well, this is just a grand conspiracy, that Christians were just, here's the story that they were wanting to tell, and they were repeating the story word for word. And so I would argue, and William Lane Craig makes this point, that these contradictions, and they're not even contradictions, but these discrepancies between the various gospel accounts are in the details of the accounts, but not in the primary content of these accounts of the resurrection. William Lane Craig makes the observation that we have 2 very different accounts historically of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome. 2 very different accounts. We also have 2 very different accounts of from survivors of the Titanic sinking and how exactly the sinking of the Titanic happened. And so we have different accounts, different eyewitness accounts of these historical events happening. But what no historian would ever say is, because of these differences in the eyewitness accounts, the events must have never happened. Because there are different accounts of the Titanic sinking, the Titanic must have not sunk. That would be ridiculous. That's absurd. And so, yes, we do have some differences in the details between the various different accounts. But what we have consistent throughout all the accounts is that Jesus was raised on the 3rd day and was observed and witnessed by the empty tomb, was witnessed by the women in the garden. We have these consistent accounts. We don't have an early account that says, oh, by the way, Jesus didn't raise from the dead. All of the accounts are consistent in the key fact, the key detail of the story. Here's another thing about the testimonies. Not only are there many testimonies and they're early and they're uniform, another thing to keep in mind about the testimonies is that the sources actually contain some embarrassing details, some scandalous details, some incriminating evidence. For example, the fact that the first person to witness the resurrected Jesus was actually not one of his disciples. His disciples were hanging out, scared for their lives, hunkered down. The first person to witness the resurrected Jesus was actually Mary Magdalene, a fairly scandalous detail. If you're wanting to start a new religion centered on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the very last person that you would have in that culture in that day discover the empty tomb was a person like Mary Magdalene. You would have had someone very powerful, someone of great esteem, discover the empty tomb. And so this is an embarrassing detail that's left in the gospel accounts, lending to their credibility. Another thing to keep in mind about the testimony is you don't just have incriminating detail, you also have unnecessary detail in these various gospel accounts. The Gospel of John is noteworthy in this regard. If you read the account of the resurrection in the Gospel of John, there's all sorts of unnecessary detail that John adds to the story. He talks about this foot race that takes place between he and Peter as they're running to the tomb, and he talks about the outcome of that race. I think John is maybe bragging a little bit. He says, I beat Peter in this race. I got to the tomb first. But then he says Peter went in before he did. There's all this unnecessary detail, the type of things that you would expect to hear from an eyewitness testimony. And so all that is to say, we have this early testimony. Now, here's what here's the immediate pushback that a skeptic will give. A skeptic will say, well, I don't care about that testimony. I don't care about the Bible. I don't believe the Bible. I believe these stories are all made up. Okay, Fine. But here's the point that I'm making. Do you believe that the Bible exists? Do you believe that the New Testament testimonies exist? You could choose not to believe them, but you can't choose to believe that they don't exist. And so the only point I'm making with the minimal facts approach is that this early testimony does exist. The disciples believed they saw something. Okay, that's the only point that I'm trying to argue. Here's the second minimal fact. And again, I'm sticking just to one word. The second fact is the tomb, the empty tomb. The Gospels actually give us the address of the place where Jesus was buried. The Gospels tell us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of a well-known man, Joseph of Arimathea. So it wasn't a secret where they were taking Jesus' body. There was no cover-up to show or to try to hide where Jesus' body was taken. And the fact is that the earliest explanation for the resurrection of Jesus was that the disciples had simply stolen the body. That was the first explanation given by the Jewish authorities to try to quell this rumor that Jesus had risen from the dead. So even in that, they're acknowledging that the body is missing, that the tomb is empty. And so the empty tomb it's one of these minimal facts that the body of Jesus was never produced. The body of Jesus was never found. So we have an emptiness of the tomb of Jesus. Here's the next minimal fact. The disciples. The testimony and the transformation of the disciples, including Paul. There's no evidence that the disciples, if you look carefully at the gospel testimony, there's no evidence that the disciples were anticipating the resurrection. No evidence whatsoever. They had no reason to anticipate the resurrection. The Jewish belief system never held that the Messiah was going to be killed and the Messiah was going to be risen again. Jews did, many of them, believe in the resurrection of the dead, but they believed in the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. They didn't believe in the resurrection of one person in the Messiah in sort of the middle of time. And so there was no reason for the disciples to be anticipating the resurrection. The disciples, in fact, were hiding for their lives, trying to figure out what their next step was going to be. But what we see in the wake of the resurrection is we see disciples transformed. Peter, in particular, he moves from denying Jesus 3 times, cursing Jesus' name, saying, I don't even know the guy, to, in the book of Acts, Peter is standing in front of the Sanhedrin, the same group of people who played a part in Jesus' crucifixion. He knows what they're capable of. And he looks at them and he says, they tell Peter, you must stop preaching in this name. You must stop declaring the resurrection of the dead. And Peter looks at them and he says, judge for yourself what is right. Should I believe you, or should I follow you, or should I follow God? I cannot unsee what I've seen. Peter is radically transformed, and radically transformed to the point of death, to the point of sacrificing himself. These disciples, if you're looking for a conspiracy, normally conspiracies are motivated by money and power. People start conspiracies because they want wealth and because they want power. The disciples, they got neither. The disciples ended up sacrificing their very lives for the truth of what they had observed. And Paul, in particular, is a noteworthy example of this. Paul, before he was Paul, was a religious zealot. He was a religious terrorist, essentially, dragging Christians, both men and women, out of their homes, persecuting them for preaching in the name of Jesus. And then after he encounters Jesus, he goes through this radical conversion, this radical transformation, where he goes from persecutor to persecuted. And again, I just offer this as a minimal fact. The transformation of the disciples demands some sort of explanation. What led them to this level of transformation? Here's another minimal fact. This is actually my last minimal fact. The existence of the church. Thousands of years later, we have this multicultural body of believers where people report that their lives are still being changed by this rather obscure Galilean preacher and teacher. Now, what we know about rabbis in the first century is when they died, their disciples dispersed, especially if they died in such a shameful way as Jesus died. There's no doubt, there's no controversy about saying that Jesus, or that anyone, frankly, dying on a cross was a scandalous thing. And so if you had a rabbi that died in a scandalous, awful way on a cross, the disciples would have been running for their lives. They would have dispersed. But what we actually observe historically is the opposite. After Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples don't disperse, they start multiplying. In Jesus' own day, he had a relatively small group of followers. But within just a generation after his ministry, his number of disciples had ballooned and had encompassed much of the Roman world at that time. And so the existence of the church demands an explanation. One of the ways that I like to illustrate this is if you went to the downtown area of wherever you live right now, and you saw today in the downtown area, you saw a man holding a sign that said, "Elvis is not dead, Elvis is alive." What would you conclude? You would probably conclude that this is a man who has lost his mind, right? And you would just go along with your day. If you went down to the same place on the next day, and instead of one guy, now there's 5, you would still kind of conclude the same thing, right? Like one crazy guy can find 4 other crazy guys to say the same crazy thing. And so you wouldn't think much about it. If you went down the next day and instead of 5, now there's 50 guys with the same sign, "Elvis isn't dead, Elvis is alive." Now you're starting to get a little antsy, right? Like, what in the world's going on in my town? Is there some convention that I missed? What's happening here? Then the next day you go down, instead of 50, then there's 500. And then there's 5,000. And then there's 500,000 and 5 million. At what point do you start to scratch your head and say, it seems crazy, but is there something going on here? Maybe there's something that I should explore. Maybe there's something that I should investigate. And so that's the only point that I'm making here with the existence of the church. With millions and even billions of lives continuing to be changed, it's a fact that demands some sort of explanation. And so here's my minimal facts. The early testimony exists. The fact that we have an empty tomb, that no body was ever produced. And by the way, I didn't put up here as a minimal fact, but I'm just assuming that one of the other minimal facts is that Jesus of Nazareth did exist and was crucified on a Roman cross. And you can establish that without even using scripture. You can establish that from Roman sources, talking about Jesus being crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate. So I'm kind of taking that for granted, I guess. But you have testimony, you have the tomb, you have the transformation of the disciples, and you have the existence of the church. And what I ask the skeptic then is, how do you explain these 4 facts? And they do have explanations for these 4 facts. But what they tend to do is they tend to focus on just one of the facts. And so, for instance, they'll talk about the empty tomb. Well, the reason that we have no body, some people have actually given this theory. The reason we have no body is because Jesus wasn't actually buried in a tomb. Jesus, as a crucified criminal, he wasn't put in a tomb. He was just thrown into a pauper's grave. Some theories even say that his body would have been consumed by scavenging animals. So this is the whole reason why we don't have a body. This is the whole reason why we have a quote unquote empty tomb. And my response to that would be, okay, that's your theory. Now, there's some problems with that theory. There's some issues there. Like one issue in particular is what we know about Jewish burial practices in the first century, even burial practices of crucified criminals, is Jews regarded it as a scandal and an offense of their holiness to leave a dead body rotting on a cross, especially during a holy time of the year. And so it would have been unthinkable for Jewish leaders to leave a criminal up on a cross. In fact, we know that religious leaders were given the duty and the responsibility of taking these criminals' bodies off the cross, preparing them for burial, not in their family's tomb, but in some other tomb. And that's in fact what we read about in the Gospels. Who took Jesus off the cross? It wasn't his followers. It wasn't his family. It was religious leaders. Whose tomb was he buried in? Joseph of Arimathea, one of the religious leaders. They were providing for the burial of this criminal. That's exactly what we would expect to see in first century Jewish burial practices. And so, again, there's problems with that theory, but my pushback that I would give to a skeptic is, you've explained this one fact, but how do you explain the other three facts? And what normally happens is they have to apply multiple different theories, some of which contradict each other, in order to explain all four of these facts. So they'll say Jesus was never buried in a tomb, and the early Christian testimony was based on a hallucination that the disciples, particularly Peter and Paul, they had a hallucination of seeing Jesus. And so, and then the church is just being deluded and manipulated through all these years. And so you have all of these complex conspiracies that are needed to explain all four of the minimal facts. And my pushback is simply this: the easiest and best explanation for these minimal facts is that Jesus, in fact, did raise from the dead. In my experience, the main reason why people don't believe in the resurrection is because resurrections don't happen in our experience. Because resurrections don't happen in our experience, we automatically assume, without investigating the evidence, we automatically assume that resurrections don't happen, right? We automatically assume that the resurrection of Jesus is mythical because resurrections in our experience don't happen. Now, what a Christian is saying, though, and this is important, what a Christian is saying is not that resurrections are common. That's not what any Christian anywhere is saying. What a Christian is actually saying is resurrections are exceedingly uncommon. They're so uncommon that we need to pay attention to this particular resurrection from the dead, because this resurrection from the dead literally changes everything. And so the way I illustrate it is this: if you went back 500 years ago, and you told a person, in 500 years, there's going to be people that get in a metal can and they are propelled into the sky all the way to the surface of the moon. And they will get out of this metal can and they will, for a period, walk around on the surface of the moon. And then they'll get back in this metal can and they will fly safely back to the surface of the earth. What would a person 500 years ago have said to you? They might have called you a witch. They would have certainly not believed you. That's impossible. No one is going to walk on the surface of the moon. But of course, we know that has happened. It's actually happened multiple times. And so simply because something is improbable doesn't mean that it is impossible. But a lot of people make that mistake with the resurrection. They assume that it's impossible without investigating any of the evidence. And as an apologist, all I'm trying to do is get them to face the evidence and explain the evidence, hopefully with the goal in mind that they will start to see how, even though the resurrection of Jesus is improbable, amazingly, the resurrection of Jesus is reasonable to believe.